Good morning, I'm Robbie Crispin, and this is Quick Court, the fastest way to justice. We're here today in the case between Jimmy Lee Marcus and Gary Toronto. Jimmy accused Gary of copying off his test. Gary pleads not guilty, saying he would never even need to cheat. Please rise, said the bailiff. For the Honorable Judge Susan Triton. Thank you everyone. Fred began his argument with a security tape he acquired. And it clearly showed Gary copying Jimmy's test answers. Well, Gary, apparently you don't know everything. Especially the difference between right and wrong. Fred and Jimmy celebrated their victory. Gee, Fred, laughed Jimmy, we sure do make a pretty good team in court. But Fred wasn't listening. He thought he heard something. Help! Help, please! Fred walked over. It was a kid in a wheelchair. Fred, what are you doing? Asked Jimmy. I gotta help this kid, replied Fred. Thank you, said the kid. I sure wish I could have a wheelchair that works itself. But after my leg and all, my family can't afford any of that. How'd you break your leg? Asked Fred. If somebody else did it, why not sue him? Some other boy pushed me on this inflatable slide, said the kid. But I can't sue him by myself. We need an attorney. And there's no way we could afford one of those. I'll tell you something about attorneys, said Fred. If you can't afford one, the government will give you one. So, I'll appoint myself to you. You would do that for me? Asked the boy. You wouldn't, would you? Asked Jimmy. You're my personal attorney, Fred. And tomorrow I have another case. It's just one case, reassured Fred. You don't understand, whined Jimmy. I don't think you understand about being generous, huffed Fred. Come on, kid, we got a case to win. Well, who will be my attorney tomorrow? Whined Jimmy. It was none other than Fred's arch-nemesis, Eduardo Monroe. Eduardo Monroe, cried Jimmy, I thought you hated me. I do, he said, but I hate Fred even more. So we must work together to defeat him. I got a bad feeling about this, said Jimmy. But Eduardo was good, and he came to the case with well-prepared evidence. Hold on a second, said Fred. Something's weird here. Our case is at the same time as Jimmy's. Well, of course, said the kid. He's the defendant. That's right. Jimmy and Fred were against each other. Oh dear, cried Fred. Jimmy, I'm so sorry. I am too, said Jimmy. Sorry that will beat you. Well, bring it on, snorted Fred. I just can't believe you pushed this child down an inflatable slide. But he didn't, said Eduardo. And we have a tape to prove it. Hold it, I'm from the local newspaper. I have a right to know. Fred, aren't you usually Jimmy's attorney? Yes, we're just making an exception, said Fred. Oh, alright. And so the case continued. The tape didn't only show that the kid and Jimmy weren't on the ride at all together, it also showed the kid running down the slide and then tripping, breaking his leg. The case abruptly ended with the lawsuits dropped. That is one sneaky, underhanded kid, laughed Eduardo. I should represent him when he appeals. Well, Jimmy, I'm sorry, apologized Fred. Actually, thanks, said Jimmy. Working against you showed that I don't really need you for everything. For most things, probably, but not everything. Well, you wouldn't have won without Eduardo, laughed Fred. You know what, said Jimmy, let's just forget this case.